All right, and welcome everybody. We are continuing our studies, and this morning we're on the book of Leviticus, a Leviticus overview this morning. So you should have that handout on the back. And for those that are watching online, welcome. So glad that you joined us, and we are excited to be able to continue in our book overview study. So we're looking in the book of Leviticus this morning, and Leviticus is not known to us in our culture as perhaps a really exciting study, but it actually is exciting when you see Jesus in it. And so there's a lot of things in there that in our culture we'll think of as boring, and what does this have to do with us? Largely Leviticus has to do with the instructions and regulations in daily living of the priesthood. So in a lot of ways we see that and we're like, man, what does that have anything to do with what we do today? But when you consider, we're reading this, consider that one of the jobs that Jesus did in one of his ministry, maybe that's even the wrong word, one of the results of his redemptive acts towards us is that he has made us kings and priests, which means he's given us the opportunity to have access to the Father. So keep that in mind as we're reading this, is that if you're saved this morning, you are a priest. So all of a sudden now Leviticus already means more. Not that we're bound by the same things, but remember, we are considered a priest today, so see all that God's done for you as we go through this great book. So, let's dive in. An overview of the book of Leviticus. The name Leviticus, surprise, surprise, if you notice, I really haven't changed this beginnings of the slide too much other than to swap out Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, because it comes from a Greek word, which is, again, let me just emphasize that that's interesting because it was written in Hebrew. So where are we getting a Greek word from? Well, we're getting it from the Septuagint. So in your English Bible, again, I'm going to reiterate for those that are watching all of these in a row, repetition is helpful. If somebody says, well, I don't believe in the Septuagint, and I always say, well, that's interesting. What do you think is the first book of the Bible? They say Genesis. I'm like, why do you call it that? We call this Leviticus, just like Genesis and Exodus, because that is from the Greek word that the Septuagint used, and it means basically things concerning the Levites. But that's not the Hebrew name for this. And you say, well, what is the original name of this book? If you were to open up a Hebrew text, and it's all written in Hebrew, what would be the name of this book? Well, they did it in a much more simple way. They basically took the first word or the first two words of the book, and that became the name of the book. So in Genesis it says in the beginning, Hebrews the beginning. That's how they did it. There's the first couple words of the book. So if you want to know the name of the book in Hebrew, basically just open up to the first couple words, first word or two in Hebrew, and that's the name of the book. The Septuagint didn't follow that line of thinking. They wanted to get the broad idea of it. So Exodus is about the exodus of Israel out of Egypt. So that makes more sense to their mind. But my point here is that the Septuagint was translated 250 years before Christ, and they took the Hebrew scriptures and they put it into Greek. You say, why did that happen? And why did Jesus and the apostles seemingly use the Septuagint? Because when they quote in our New Testament and you go back in your Old Testament, it doesn't match. You say, why? Because they're quoting from the Greek text. So this is very significant for us. So that's a big topic. So I'll just mention a little bit each time, and maybe one day you'll go, I get it. It's a lot. It's a big, wide study in and of itself. But as the Grecian Empire rolled in with Alexander the Great, between the Testaments, between Old and New Testament, he Hellenized the world. That means he made the world more Greek in culture and in language. But when the Romans took over, the official language was Latin. But they didn't care to impose their language and culture on people. They just wanted your taxes and peace. That's all they cared. They ruled with an iron fist. They ruled with a sword. Hey, you guys can have your Jewish culture. You can have your temple. You can have your own temple tax. We don't care. Peace, and then render unto Caesar what is Caesar's, and we're good. So they didn't need to impose Latin everywhere. But Alexander the Great did not think that way. He wanted to impose Greek everywhere. So although they're under the Roman Empire with the Latin as their official language, Greek was the dominant language. And it was for many years. Latin slowly takes over, and then of course we have a translation into Latin called the Latin Vulgate by Jerome, which would be the official Bible of eventually the Catholic Church. So that's the name. It is book number 3 of 39 of the Old Testament, 39 being the total books in the Old Testament. There's 27 chapters in Leviticus. So not that I'm going to do this all the way through, but let's do a little trivia questions, okay? Trivia questions. Just see if you know them. So how many chapters are in Genesis? Anybody want to take a stab? 50 chapters in Genesis. How many chapters in Deuteronomy? Or Exodus. Sorry. You knew I was going to ask that. I was going to say, you knew I was going to ask that. No, I didn't know you were going to ask about Deuteronomy. 40, good job. 40 in Exodus. So we have 50, 40, 27. So is that important? I don't know. I don't know how important that is. The chapter breakdown is not inspired. So it's not, I think this is one way I practically use chapters, because I understand I really study chapter IDs. In other words, I want to know that Leviticus 16 is an important chapter. It's the Day of Atonement. I want to know that. Leviticus chapter 10, Nadab and Abihu, Aaron's sons, are killed by the Lord for profaning the fire before the temple. Those are important for me to know. A lot of times when people will ask questions, I'll know the chapter that question's in. Many times they won't know. And I'll say, oh, you mean this passage. But another way that I use it too is if somebody is trying to maybe debate, or they're throwing out an idea and they're saying, this is in Romans 17, I think. And I'm like, there is no Romans 17. I know they don't know what they're talking about. So it's good for us to know. You don't want to have two Christians battling about Matthew 29 when there is no Matthew 29. That kind of idea. So I think it's good to know the chapters and the identification of the chapters. It helps us to be knowledgeable. Here's the section that this is found in, same as the other two. We're still in the first 5 books because that's our first section. The first 5 books are the books of Moses, sometimes called the Law, or the Pentateuch, the 5 books. That first section is a section all to itself that Moses is given the credit to be the author and the compiler and the editor of these books. What's the general theme of Leviticus? Well, the book is primarily concerned with the laws and the regulations of Israel as a nation. But even more so, it's really focused on the Levites. And even a subsection of the Levites are the priesthood of the Levites. This is the priestly tribe of Israel. And by the way, I don't think I caught this when I was a kid growing up, so let me make sure I say this. Just because you're in the tribe of Levi does not mean that you're a priest. So the priesthood was a subsection of the Levitical tribe, or the tribe of Levi. So the Levites, concerning the priesthood, would be a subsection of that, okay? I don't think I caught that growing up. Into my college years trying to learn the Bible, it was just, that was new information when I got that. And of course that makes sense, there'd be too many. But I just thought, oh, you're a Levite, you're a priest. That's not the way it was. And by the way, there's different kinds of priests. There would be daily priests ministering in the tabernacle, and then eventually in the temple. They would do things like swap out the bread every day. Remember, there was the showbread. There would be one level of priests that would minister daily. And they would go in and swap out the showbread. They would go in and swap out the oil to keep the candles going and lit. And they would do daily things, but they wouldn't dare go past the curtain. They did daily things in the front room, the holy place. But they wouldn't dare. That was only for one person, and that was the high priest. The high priest is the one that he only went past that curtain once per year. And I mentioned it a moment ago, that's called the Day of Atonement, and that's once per year. That's in Leviticus 16. So in this case, it's Aaron, the first high priest. So you have a daily sort of lower level priest that would swap out things every day. And by the way, they couldn't wait to get out of there. They were in that room and they weren't very comfortable. Because if they did something wrong, as we find out in Leviticus 10, Nadab and Abihu, Aaron's sons, they used the fire in the inappropriate way. The Bible says they profaned that fire. In other words, they used a set-apart thing in a holy thing in an ordinary sense. That's what profane means. And the Lord took their lives. They did that. So it wasn't a very comfortable spot to be in. But check this out. What if you were standing in there and you had authority to be in there as a priest? What if the curtain fell down and then instead of 2 rooms, there was only 1 room? Now are you allowed to be in there? Well, that had never happened before, and I guarantee you they would have ran out. But that's precisely what happened with Jesus. So think with me. If you're a daily priest and you can be there and the curtain comes down, now instead of 2 rooms, there's 1 room. That's what happened when Jesus came and tore down that veil of partition. He allowed the everyday priest to have access to the Holy of Holies. So when that curtain comes down at his death, burial, and his resurrection, he renders the temple system useless, and there's now no partition between the everyday priests and the high priest. Now they can share in the same room. So that's beautiful once you see the breakdown. So it's primarily about the Levites, the priestly tribe of Israel. And they were designated as the servants of the temple. See, and you're going to get so tired of me saying this, but I'm going to say it so you understand. Judaism is a temple system. I cannot say that strongly enough or repeat it enough times. Judaism is a temple system. What do I mean by that? Why is that so very important? Because if there's no temple, there's no Judaic age. There's no Judaism at all. And you say, but wait a second, Ken, the temple was destroyed in AD 70, and I still see people in Israel, and they're still going about saying they have Judaism. Judaism still exists today. Oh, that's true. But the definition of Judaism has changed. It's not biblical Judaism. It's not what we would call Old Testament Judaism. And as far as the Jews today in Israel are concerned, it's not Hebraic scriptural Judaism. It's Talmudic Judaism. You might as well not call it Judaism as far as we're concerned. It's a totally separate thing. They follow something called the Talmud. They do not follow they can't follow the book of Leviticus. They can't. Why? Because it's a temple system. It requires a temple to work. I have people ask me all the time, well, what are you going to think if they rebuild a temple one day in Jerusalem? Well, you might as well put Walmart over the sign, or UPS, or Amazon. See, these are not throwaway terms. The definition of temple matters. The definition is, this is how you have access to God. And so I don't care if the best builder in the world builds the best building in the world and throws a sign up that says, this is the 3rd temple. I don't care what you put on the sign. God's not inhabiting that place. That's not his system. In these last days, book of Hebrews, God has spoken unto us by his Son. End of discussion. Jesus is the new temple. The time period is very interesting. If you remember, we're going through our time period and we're working our way to the cross. So remember, we're in BC, which means before Christ. And we're working our way down to the year 1. So this is working our way down as we get closer to Jesus. But you'll notice our time period for the book of Leviticus is just 1 year. And that's because there's no events happening in Leviticus, really. All of the events happen within a 1-year time span, because this book is primarily all about just instruction. It's not advancing the narrative of the story. It's just an instructional book. So we just have the 1 year, 1445. What's the scarlet thread? In other words, remember what we mean by that when we say scarlet thread. We're saying a weaving tapestry that's describing Christ all the way from Genesis all the way to his birth. And we call that weaving tapestry, we call that a scarlet thread. What's connecting all these things? One author that's orchestrating this giant cohesive story to bring about the Messiah for the redemption of sins. Well, remember when Jesus got on the scene, and you could turn with me if you would to John chapter 2. John chapter 2. Jesus is the reality of the temple. Jesus is the reality of the temple. And so as we're learning about the temple, It's also significant to know where the Jews are coming from in the first century when Jesus says the following story. In John chapter 2 and verses 13 through 22, John records this. He says, "Now the Passover of the Jews was at hand, and Jesus went up to Jerusalem. And he found in the temple those who sold oxen and sheep and doves and money changers doing business. When he made a whip of cords, he drove them all out of the temple and the sheep and the oxen, and poured out the changers' money and overturned the tables. He said to those who sold doves, 'Take these things away. Do not make my Father's house a house of merchandise.' Then his disciples remembered that it was written, 'Zeal for your house has eaten me up.'" Verse 18. "So the Jews answered and said to him, 'What sign do you show us since you do these things?' Jesus answered and said to them," you ready for the sign? Here's the sign. He said, "Destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up." Now Jesus is standing in the temple when he says this. He's standing in the temple. And he says to them, "Destroy this temple." Now, they thought he meant the structure of the building. And why wouldn't they? Why wouldn't they? I would have. And Jesus wanted them to think that. He was setting them up. And so they thought he was talking about the blocks and the building and the construction. And he says, if you, it says destroy this temple, the implication is you destroy this temple. Not I will, but you destroy this temple. Because who's going to take his life? They are. So he says, destroy this temple, and in 3 days I will raise it up. Verse 20, the Jews said, it's taken 46 years to build this temple. You're going to raise it up in 3 days? Almost like they're missing the destruction part. Why would the temple be destroyed? By you? No, they focused on the construction part. It took us all these years, 46 years. You're going to do it in 3 days? And then John makes sure we don't miss how to use Leviticus in our study and understanding our salvation. John uses divine commentary here and connects the dots for the reader. John says, but he was speaking of the temple of his body. Jesus is using a giant metaphor illustration here. Therefore, when he had risen from the dead, his disciples remembered that he had said this to them, and they believed the scripture and the word which Jesus had said. So in verses 21 and 22 of John 2, John is taking the reader to the end of his story. He said, remember, bookmark this, dear reader, because at the end of the resurrection, the disciples remembered this. So he's giving you the hyperlink for you in this case. He's really, really helping us out. I think it's because John didn't want to take any chances. He wanted to make sure the reader really understood this point. He says, remember this, come back to this at the end of the letter, at the end of my biography. Remember what the disciples said? They remembered this moment. So interestingly, John takes you on his own commentary within the book and says, remember this, dear reader. This is what the disciples remembered about. So this is very important as we're reading through the book of Leviticus, is that it is a shadow, it is an arrow pointing towards Christ. And one of the key chapters in this, I suppose I could pick out a couple, but I really like to know, it'd be good for you to put this in your back pocket, Leviticus 16, Day of Atonement. Because remember, that's the one time per year that the high priest would go into the Holy of Holies. That's the one time he would pull back the curtain, and in this case, Aaron, or whoever would be the high priest, would go in and make the sacrifice. He's already made a sacrifice for himself out in the courtyard, but then he would then go back and make a sacrifice for the sins of the people. And everybody would stand on pins and needles, and they would just pray that the Lord would accept that sacrifice. And they would give a huge worship, a worship celebration would just break out in Israel if the sacrifice was accepted. But it may be a little bit more selfish than you think. You say, well, these people are on fire for God. I mean, their worship service is so vibrant. Well, actually, maybe that's true. But if you saw the sacrifice accepted, then remember what you're saying. That the Lord accepted the slit throat of that animal in my place. That means it's their neck, not mine, for at least another year. So that's good news. I worship the Lord that He accepted the animal on my behalf, because I didn't want to get my throat slit. So why exactly do we worship the Lord today? Boy, I tell you, we should worship the Lord for His goodness. But man, look at all He's done for us. That He took upon Himself our sin in His body. And I will worship Him freely, I will admit, for a very selfish reason. That Jesus resurrected so that I can resurrect. I celebrate the resurrection today primarily for my own resurrection one day. In this sense, I worship Him for His greatness and His power and His glory. But my goodness, also what that means to me. So Day of Atonement is a significant chapter. If you have time to read that, I would encourage you to. Of course you have time. I would encourage you to read that. Let me not make it so soft there. I'd read that chapter if I were you. Here's some significant characters in this book. Of course, I put this in. You say, well, that's kind of a given. Isn't the Lord the significant character in all of them? I should have probably been putting this in Genesis and Exodus, because the answer is no. And what I mean by no is not that the Lord's not important in every book. He is. But I mean that literarily, as far as literature goes, like for example in the book of Ruth, He's not mentioned. And so there's going to be sometimes He won't be one of the main characters. Now we know as believers that the Holy Spirit is overseeing this process. But He's not necessarily mentioned very much in some other books. So we want to make sure that we start putting that in. Also, another reason why I wanted to put this in too is notice that it is all capital letters. Capital L-O-R-D, all caps. Now in your English Bibles, there are more than one underlying Hebrew word for the word Lord. And your English translators have helped you to know which one it is. When we see all capital L-O-R-D, it is the Hebrew word, what we say, Yahweh. Really, we're adding vowels for it to make sense. It's probably more like Yahweh, something like that, because there's no vowels. It's also Jehovah, depending on how you pronounce your Y's and your J's. So Jehovah, Yahweh, same word. It depends on how you want to pronounce it. The best we can say is it's Yod-He, Vav-He. Yod-He, Vav-He. Y-H-W-H. If you ever see, I see this on people's hats sometimes or their shirts. They'll say Y-H-W-H. And you say, what is that? It's because if you were to just take the 4 Hebrew letters and put them into English, you'd get Y-H-W-H. Try to pronounce Y-H-W-H. I don't know how you'd say that, but we add some vowels so that it makes it a little easier. And that's how we get the word Yahweh. It's also Jehovah. If the Y is to a J and the W is a V, Jehovah. So it just depends on how you're saying that. But just so your knowledge sake, you don't get confused, that's all the same. Now, if it's capital L, lowercase O-R-D, it's usually Adonai. Adonai. And that just simply means master. Whereas Yahweh or Jehovah, either one, that's a covenantal name that He used when He was speaking about His relationship with the nation of Israel. I hope you're picking up on when I emphasize words. The nation of Israel. That's what happened at the base of Mount Sinai. So hopefully you'll pick up on my little nuances as a teacher. And we're going through, because I'm using very specific, I'm trying to hit certain words for you to remember. Oh yeah, they weren't always a nation. The nation of Israel. Why? Because remember, Jacob's name was changed to Israel, and then he had children. It was just the children of Jacob. It was a family until we get to the base of Mount Sinai. And then secondly, we see Moses. He's a significant figure in Leviticus. Of course, he's the one that the Lord is using. And of course, his older brother, by 3 years, his older brother Aaron. He's 3 years older. If you want to see how we know that, you can check out Exodus 7:7. Now, Aaron had these 2 sons we're going to talk about for just a moment. Their names are Nadab and Abihu. They're also, I don't know how significant they are, but they are mentioned. it's good to know who they were. They're the sons of Aaron, whom the Lord devoured with fire. And this is found in Leviticus chapter 10. And I say that because I want to just share with you real quickly why that happened. Because I don't necessarily have this in your notes, although it is number one in our repeated biblical themes. But I want to talk to you just for the time we have left, which is about 5 minutes. I want to talk to you about the concept of holiness. Holiness. Because that's why they were burned with fire. Okay? What do you think of when you hear the word holiness? I mean, we hear in the Bible it says, "Be ye holy, for I am holy." What does that mean? What's the command for us? Now we're reading that in the New Covenant. Peter's saying the Lord wants us to be holy because He's holy. What does it mean to be holy? Okay, somebody says set apart. Do anybody else have an idea? Perfect. Okay, so what? Pure? Okay, so we have these ideas. Pure, set apart, perfect. Now let me just kind of tell you where I've been at. I always say growing up because I grew up in the church, then went to Bible college, and so it took a while for my views to even change from that because they were so embedded in me. But I grew up kind of having the idea, probably like a lot of us, that holiness means perfection in our actions, meaning sinlessness. So holiness would be free from sin. Now, holiness may have that as a byproduct, but that's not what the word itself means. The word in and of itself does not mean anything to do with actions, but it has to do with position and intent. The very, very simple way that I could say holiness is set apart. Like you said, set apart. Sanctified means set apart with a purpose. Let me give you an example. If when I was growing up, my mom had a set of dish towels. I say dish towels. What's the better way to say that? Ladies, you can probably tell me. But when you go into the bathroom, when I was a really little kid, I come from soccer practice, I had dirt all over me, kicked off my cleats outside, got dirt all over. And Mom has these perfect white towels for, as a kid, you think they're useless because they're for looks. They're for looks. Maybe once a year a guest might come over and they'd wash their hands or something, and they may dry their hands on these towels, once a year. These are to look good, and then the normal everyday towels are for the kids to, maybe they can get those a little dirty. And those are set apart with a purpose. That would be a definition or a visual for the word holy. It's set apart for something. Now, if I'm 7-year-old Kenny and I come in from soccer practice, which was all the time, and I go in and I take one of those towels and I'm wiping this and wiping the dirt off my face, and there's all this mud on it, when Mom Mady sees that, boy, that's not going to be a good thing. Now, what did I just do? Here, and I'm trying to teach you a Bible word so you can understand it. The Bible word here is I have profaned the towel. I have used in an ordinary way something that was set apart with a specific purpose. I profaned it. I used it in a sense that should have not been used. So if you can get that simple illustration, you have got a lot, theologically speaking. You now know what holy means, whether it's a cup, whether it's a spoon, because we're going to see a lot of that in the book of Leviticus when you study it. Cups and spoons and ringlets and staves. These are set apart for my purpose. Okay, now let's go back to what Peter said. Be ye holy, for I am holy. But is that if that immediately heaps pressure on you to never sin, then you're missing the point. You're missing the point. Be ye holy, for I am holy does not mean you better not sin because I don't sin. You're missing the point. You're putting the cart before the horse. Because what the Lord is getting at us is, I want you to be set aside for a specific purpose in life because I am set aside. And as I am set aside, then you need to be set aside for my use. If you can get that in your mind, that we are set aside and to not profane, don't use your life as something ordinary. Use your life as something set apart for Christ. Now, if I focus on that, Lord, let my life be set apart for you. If I get that in my head, then the actions part will follow, but that's a byproduct. Me living in a sinless way is a byproduct of my understanding that I am to live in a holy way. They're not the same. Let's just look at repeated themes real quick and then we'll be done. Holiness, we just talked about. Sacrifice, of course, through the animal sacrificial system. The idea of covenant is going to be repeated. Of course, the worship service I already told you a little bit about. Worthship is one way to really remember that. You're attributing worth to the Lord. The redemptive acts of those animals and the redemptive acts we see in Christ. Loving others is also in Leviticus. Love your neighbors yourself is found in Leviticus. Cleansing from sin. And also we see the cloud appear in the book of Leviticus as a sense of God's presence. He says, and then the cloud will appear and I will be in the cloud. We see these repeated themes. So when we talk about the Lord coming in the clouds of heaven, he was calling back these ideas of his presence coming in judgment. Here's a very basic outline of this book and we'll be through. There's 5 offerings that are mentioned in Leviticus chapters 1 through 7. We have the burnt, the meal, peace, sin, and trespass. There's instructions given for each one. I'll just say real quickly, the burnt offering was a whole offering that was fully burnt up for the Lord. But some of these other offerings, just so you have an idea of them, and we can go into this another time, I'm already out of time, but just so you have an awareness of this, when people would bring these offerings before the priest, some of these were offerings that the priest would use to eat. So if you brought a grain offering before, a portion of that would go to the priest's family, and it was meant that then that would take care of their family. So you made an offering out of your first fruits, and then the priest would actually use that, give an offering to the Lord, and then he'd bring it to his wife and make bread for their family. In a lot of sense, that's what a lot of these offerings were, dual purpose for that. That was God's plan. You can read all about the priesthood in chapters 8 through 10. Holiness in daily or personal life in 11 through 22. A lot of the holy days are mentioned in chapter 23. Laws and prophecies for the Holy Land in 24 through 26, and then dedication and devotion in chapter 27. I don't think we had enough time to go over all that I wanted to. As you can see, we went pretty fast. I wanted to tell you each about those offerings. In my head, we had time to go into the offerings, but I'll have to say that for another time. But thank you for joining us. We'll get to Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, the book of Numbers next time we do our biblical book overview.